I have stood vigil for 10,000 years. This is not metaphor. This is not the exaggeration of legend or the inflation of myth. I have existed since before the Imperium bore that name, have walked the halls of the Imperial Palace since its foundations were laid in the bedrock of the Himalayas, have served at the right hand of the Emperor himself in ages when he still walked among us, when his voice could still be heard, when his light was a living flame rather than the guttering ember that now sustains humanity's fragile hope. I am Valdor's legacy. I am the Emperor's intention made flesh. I am one of the 10,000, the Adeptus Custodes, the golden guardians who have protected the master of mankind since the earliest days of his emergence from the shadows of history. My name is Diocletian Koros. I have borne this name for 11 millennia, have carried it through wars that reshaped the galaxy, through betrayals that shattered everything we built, through the long silence that followed our father's ascension to the golden throne. I am ancient beyond the comprehension of mortal men, have outlived civilizations that rose and fell, while I stood unchanging at my post, have watched generations of humanity be born and grow and die and be forgotten, while I remembered, always remembered, the duty that was written into my flesh. Before the first of them drew breath, I do not speak often. The Custodes are not given to speech. We communicate through glance and gesture, through the subtle language of warriors who have fought beside each other for longer than most species have existed. But I have been commanded to speak now, to record this testimony for those who will never know what we have known, who will never understand what we have sacrificed, who see only the golden giants who guard the eternity gate and do not comprehend the weight of history that presses upon our shoulders with every breath we take. This is the history of the Adeptus Custodes, not the sanitized version that the Administratum teaches, not the mythologized legends that the ecclesiarchy preaches, but the truth as I have witnessed it, as I have lived it, as I carry it in memories that span the entire existence of the Imperium and reach back further still into ages that have been forgotten by all except those of us who were there. I will tell you of our creation in the gene laboratories of terror, when the Emperor was still a figure of shadow and rumor, when humanity's future hung in the balance and the master of mankind forged weapons capable of ensuring that future would come to pass. I will tell you of the unification wars, when we waded through the blood of tyrants and despots to unite a fractured world under a single banner. I will tell you of the Great Crusade, when we walked beside our Father among the stars, bringing light to a galaxy that had known only darkness for 15,000 years. And I will tell you of the heresy, of the betrayal that broke us, of the day when our brothers fell to madness and malice, when the walls of the palace itself were breached by those who had sworn to defend them, when the Emperor faced his most beloved son in combat and emerged victorious but broken, diminished, condemned to an eternity of suffering upon the throne that sustains him still. I will tell you of the long vigil, the 10,000 years since that day when we withdrew behind the walls of the palace and guarded a master who could no longer speak to us, who could no longer lead us, who could only endure in silent agony while the Imperium he built crumbled around him. I will tell you what it means to serve a God who cannot acknowledge your service, to protect a father who cannot recognize his sons, to maintain a vigil that has no foreseeable end against threats that multiply with each passing century. And I will tell you of the present, of the galaxy that burns around us, of the return of the Primarch and the changes it has wrought in an order that had not changed for 10 millennia, of the wars we now fight beyond the walls we swore never to leave, of the future that awaits us, whatever that future might be. This is our story. This is the truth of the 10,000. Listen and understand what it means to be the Emperor's chosen, his first and final line of defense. The golden blades that have guarded humanity's future since before there was a humanity worth guarding. We did not begin as we are now. This is the first truth, the foundation upon which all understanding must rest. The Custodes you see today, the towering giants in auramite gold, wielding weapons that can split tanks and wearing armor that can turn aside the fury of stars. We are the culmination of a process that began in darkness and uncertainty. In the early days of the Emperor's emergence, when he was still learning the limits of his own power, still experimenting with the technologies that would eventually reshape the galaxy, the Emperor created us in the gene forges of terror, in laboratories hidden beneath mountains that no longer exist, in facilities that were old when the first human civilizations raised their primitive monuments to forgotten gods. He did not create us from templates, as he would later create the Space Marines. He did not mass produce us in factories of flesh, as the Mechanicum would later produce its servitors. He crafted us individually, each custodian a unique work of art, a singular expression of his vision for what humanity might become. I do not remember my creation. None of us do. The process that transforms a human infant into a custodian begins before consciousness has fully formed, reshapes the mind as thoroughly as it reshapes the body, builds something new from the foundation of what existed before. I know only that I was once human, was once a child born to parents whose names I never knew, was taken in the earliest days of my existence and remade into something that transcended the limitations of my species. The process takes decades. This is another truth that separates us from our lesser cousins, the Adeptus Astartes. A space marine can be created in years, transformed from adolescent to superhuman warrior through a process that is brutal but efficient, that produces soldiers in sufficient numbers to fight the galaxy's wars. We cannot be created so quickly. Each custodian represents a lifetime of labor, of careful modification, of sculpting flesh and bone and mind into configurations that push against the very boundaries of what is possible for beings of biological origin. There were failures. In the early days, especially, before the Emperor had perfected his techniques, before the gene wrights who served him had learned to interpret his designs with sufficient precision, there were many who did not survive the transformation, who emerged broken or twisted or simply dead, their bodies unable to bear the weight of what they were being made to carry. I do not know how many died so that I might live. I do not know how many failures preceded my success. I know only that I emerged from the forges complete, functional, ready to serve the purpose for which I had been created. We were not the Emperor's first warriors. This is a truth that few outside the 10,000 know, a history that has been deliberately obscured because it serves no purpose to remember those who came before us, those who were superseded, those who were deemed insufficient for the tasks that lay ahead. Before the Custodes, there were others, prototypes, experiments, attempts at creating superhuman soldiers that achieved partial success before being set aside in favor of more refined designs. I have seen the records. I have walked through chambers in the deepest vaults of the palace, where the remains of those early experiments are preserved, where bodies that are almost custodian, but not quite lie in stasis fields, monuments to the failures that preceded our success. They are not spoken of. They are not remembered. They exist only as warnings, as reminders that even the Emperor's genius required iteration, that even the master of mankind learned through trial and error. We emerged into a world at war. Terror in those ages was not the throne world of a galactic empire. It was a hellscape of competing techno-barbarian kingdoms, of warlords and tyrants who had carved the cradle of humanity into 1,000 bleeding pieces, of populations enslaved and brutalized by rulers whose only law was strength. The age of strife had reduced humanity's birth world to savagery, had erased the glories of the dark age of technology and replaced them with brutality and ignorance, and the endless, grinding violence of petty men fighting over the ruins of greatness they could not comprehend. The Emperor emerged from the shadows to reclaim this world, and we emerged with him, golden shadows at his side, the instruments through which his will would be enacted, the blades that would cut away the corruption and leave behind only what was worthy of survival. The unification wars had begun, and with them the history of the Adeptus Custodes, the history I have witnessed, the history I have lived, the history that has shaped me across 11,000 years of service. Let me tell you what it was like to fight at the Emperor's side, when he was still a warrior rather than a sacrifice, when his sword still drank the blood of those who opposed humanity's future, when we were not guardians of a tomb, but soldiers in a war that would determine the fate of our entire species. Let me tell you of the dawn of our order, before the long night that would follow. The unification wars were not a war. They were a crucible. I remember the first battle I fought at the Emperor's side. Remember it with a clarity that time cannot erode, that 10,000 years have not diminished, that burns in my memory as brightly now as it did on the day I witnessed it. We descended upon the fortress palace of Nathan Doom, the tyrant of the Pan-Pacific Empire, whose armies had defied the Emperor's call to unity, whose gene-crafted warriors had been bred for 100 generations to serve as instruments of oppression, whose cruelty had become legendary even in an age when cruelty was the common currency of power. The Emperor went first. This is something that those who know only the silent God upon the golden throne cannot comprehend. In those days, he did not lead from behind walls of gold and ceremony. He led from the front, his sword blazing with light that was not entirely light, his presence a weight upon reality itself that bent the world around him, that made the very air heavy with potential, that announced to all who witnessed it that something more than human walked among them. We followed in his wake, golden shadows cast by a sun that had taken mortal form. We did not fight as the Thunder Warriors fought, those prototype soldiers who had been created before us, whose rage and brutality had been useful in the earliest campaigns, but whose design was flawed, whose bodies burned too bright and too fast, who were destined for obsolescence from the moment of their creation. We fought with precision, with economy, with the absolute efficiency of weapons designed to kill without waste, without excess, without anything that did not serve the immediate purpose of ending the lives of those who stood against the Emperor's vision. I killed 47 men in that battle. I remember each of them, their faces, their weapons, the sounds they made as they died, the positions of their bodies when they fell. Custodian memory is not human memory. We do not forget. We cannot forget. Every death we inflict is recorded in the architecture of our minds, preserved with perfect fidelity, carried with us until the day our own existence ends. This is the burden of our design, the price we pay for the perfection we were given. Nathan Doom died by the Emperor's hand, his gene-crafted bodyguards cut down around him, his fortress palace burning, his empire, built across generations of tyranny, ended in a single day. I watched the Emperor deliver the killing blow, watched the tyrant's body fall, watched the light go out of eyes that had commanded the deaths of millions. There was no satisfaction in the Emperor's expression, no triumph, no joy. There was only completion, the fulfillment of a necessary task, the removal of an obstacle on the path to a future that only he could fully perceive. This was the pattern of the unification wars. This was our purpose in those early years, to walk beside the Emperor as he dismantled the old world and built something new from its ashes. We fought techno-barbarians whose weapons were relics of ages past, gene witches whose mastery of biological manipulation rivaled the Emperor's own, psyker kings who had carved out domains through the power of their minds, machine cults that worshipped intelligences their ancestors had created and then lost control of. We fought everything that stood between humanity and unity, and we won battle after battle, campaign after campaign, because we could not lose, because the Emperor would not permit us to lose, because the future he was building required our victory, and therefore our victory was assured. But we were not his only soldiers. The Thunder Warriors fought beside us in those campaigns, those magnificent, tragic creatures whose sacrifice made everything that followed possible. They were not like us. They were larger, stronger in the most immediate sense, built for raw power rather than refined precision, designed to break enemies through overwhelming force rather than surgical efficiency. They were the hammer where we were the scalpel, the storm where we were the silence that followed. And they were dying, slowly, invisibly, by design. I did not understand this truth until much later, until after the unification wars had ended and the Thunder Warriors had been retired. The Emperor had built obsolescence into their flesh, had created warriors who would burn brightly and briefly, who would serve their purpose and then fade, who would not live to see the empire they had helped to build. They were too unstable for the future he envisioned, too violent, too uncontrollable. They were tools designed for a specific task, and when that task was complete, they were set aside. I witnessed their ending. At Mount Ararat, where the last of the Thunder Warriors were gathered under the pretense of celebration, I watched as they realized what was happening, as they understood that the Emperor they had served had deemed them unworthy of the future they had purchased with their blood. Some fought, some raged, some simply stood in stunned silence as the Custodes, we who had fought beside them, who had shared trenches and battlefields and the camaraderie of warriors united in purpose, cut them down. I killed 11 Thunder Warriors that day. 11 brothers in arms who had trusted me, who had believed that our shared service meant something, who died with betrayal in their eyes and questions on their lips that would never be answered. I did not hesitate. I did not question. I executed the Emperor's will as I had been designed to execute it, as I had been created to execute it, as I would continue to execute it for 10,000 years and more. This was my first lesson in the true nature of service. Not all sacrifices are acknowledged. Not all debts are paid. Sometimes the instruments of victory must be discarded so that victory can endure, and those who do the discarding must carry the weight of that necessity forever. I carry it still. I will carry it until I fall. The unification wars ended, and Terra was united under a single banner for the first time in 15,000 years. The Emperor stood triumphant upon a world that had been chaos and made it order, had been division and made it unity, had been dying and given it the chance to live. And he looked upward, toward the stars that had been lost during the age of strife, toward the millions of human worlds that had been cut off from Terra for millennia, toward a galaxy that waited to be reclaimed. The Great Crusade began. I cannot convey what it felt like to leave Terra for the first time, to stand upon a vessel that sailed between the stars, to look back at the world of my creation as it dwindled to a point of light among millions of other points, each one a sun, many of them orbited by worlds where human beings lived and died in ignorance of the Imperium that was coming to claim them. The scale was staggering, overwhelming, a vastness that even custodian minds struggled to encompass. We had unified a world. Now we would unify a galaxy. The Emperor created the Primarchs for this task, 20 demigod sons, each one a masterwork that exceeded even what we Custodes represented. Each one designed to be a general, a leader, a symbol around which armies could rally. From them came the Legiones, Astartes, the Space Marines, warriors created in the image of their Primarchs, mass-produced in numbers that dwarfed our own, designed to fight the wars that the Crusade would require. We watched this happen. We watched our role diminish, our purpose narrow, our place in the Emperor's design shift from essential to ceremonial. The Space Marinas were not our equals. In single combat, a custodian would triumph over an Astartes 9 times in 10. But there were millions of them, legions upon legions, enough to conquer a galaxy, while we numbered only in the thousands. We became guardians rather than conquerors, protectors of the Emperor's person rather than instruments of his expansion, keepers of the palace that was being built on terror, rather than soldiers in the wars that raged across the stars. Some of my brothers struggled with this transition. We had been created for war, designed to kill, trained across decades to be the finest warriors humanity had ever produced. To be relegated to guard duty, however sacred that duty might be, felt like a diminishment, a waste of potential, a squandering of capabilities that had been honed to razor perfection. I did not share their discontent. I had seen the Thunder Warriors' fate. I had learned what happened to instruments that outlived their usefulness. If the Emperor wished us to guard rather than conquer, then guarding was what we would do, and we would do it with the same absolute commitment that we brought to everything. And we would not question, because questioning was not our purpose, had never been our purpose, would never be our purpose. The Great Crusade burned across the galaxy for 2 centuries. World after world fell to the Imperium, brought into compliance by the Legiones, Astartes, and their Primarch commanders, integrated into a growing empire that stretched across millions of light years, that encompassed billions of souls, that seemed destined to unite all of humanity under a single banner as terror had been united millennia before. We watched from the palace. We guarded the Emperor as he worked on projects he did not share with us, as he descended into laboratories beneath the mountain, and emerged weeks later with weariness in his eyes and burdens he would not name. We performed our duty, our endless duty, and we waited for the day when the crusade would be complete and the Imperium would be at peace, and our vigil would become something other than preparation for wars that might never come. That day never arrived. The peace we waited for never came. Instead, the heresy came, and everything we had built began to burn. I will not recount the full history of the Horus heresy. Others have documented it in exhaustive detail. The turning of Horus Lupercal at Davin, the corruption that spread through half the Legiones Astartes, the civil war that consumed the Imperium in flames that have never truly been extinguished. I will tell you only what I witnessed, what I experienced, what I carry in memories that cannot be erased, no matter how desperately I might wish to erase them. The first word reached Terra like a blade in the dark. Horus had turned. The War Master, the favored son, the general to whom the Emperor had entrusted the entire Great Crusade. He had fallen to powers we did not yet fully understand, had pledged himself and his legion to entities that dwelt beyond the veil of reality, had declared war upon the Father who had created him and the Imperium that Father had built. I was present when the Emperor received this news. I stood in the throne room of the palace, not the current throne room, not the chamber of the golden throne, where he now sits in eternal agony, but an earlier space, a hall of beauty and light, where he had once received petitioners and issued decrees and governed an empire that spanned the stars. I watched his face as the message was delivered, watched for some sign of the reaction that such betrayal should provoke. Grief, rage, denial, anything that might indicate the wound this news had inflicted upon a being who had raised Horus as a son, had loved him as only immortals can love, had trusted him with everything. There was nothing. His expression did not change. His eyes did not waver. He simply absorbed the information, processed it, and began to issue orders for the defense of everything we had built. If he grieved, he did not show it. If he raged, he contained it within walls that even we could not perceive. He became, in that moment, something colder than I had ever seen him. A general rather than a father. A strategist rather than a creator. A being who had set aside whatever remained of his human heart in order to do what needed to be done. I do not know if this was strength or something else entirely. I have had 10,000 years to consider the question, and I still cannot answer it. The heresy burned across the galaxy for 7 years, though the flames it kindled have never truly died. Worlds fell to the traitors in numbers too vast to count. Legions that had been brothers turned upon each other with hatred that only former love can generate. The Imperium that had taken 2 centuries to build began to collapse in years, in months, in days, as systems declared for Horus or remained loyal to Terra, or simply dissolved into chaos as the structures that had maintained order were consumed by the fires of civil war. We waited. This is the truth that shames me still, the failure that I carry beside all my other failures. While the galaxy burned, while our brothers in the loyalist legions bled and died to slow the traitor advance, while the future of humanity hung in the balance of battles fought across millions of light years, we waited on Terra, guarding an emperor who had retreated into his laboratories, who was working on projects he would not explain, who seemed to have abandoned the war in favor of pursuits we could not comprehend. I wanted to fight. Every fiber of my being screamed for release, for the chance to match my blade against the traitors who had shattered everything we had built, for the satisfaction of killing those who had betrayed oaths that should have been unbreakable. But we were not permitted. Our duty was to guard the Emperor, and the Emperor had not commanded us to war. So we waited, and we trained, and we prepared for a battle that we knew was coming, but could not hasten, could not prevent, could only meet when it finally arrived at our gates. The siege of Terra began in the 7th year of the heresy. Horus brought his fleets to the Sol system, brought millions of traitor soldiers and space marines, brought demons that poured through the wounds his sorcerers had torn in reality, brought everything he had gathered across 7 years of war and directed it at the world where his father waited, at the palace that had been built to be humanity's monument to its own achievement, at the walls behind which the 10,000 had waited for this moment since the first reports of betrayal reached our ears. I will not describe the siege in its entirety. The battles lasted for months, consumed millions of lives, produced horrors that have scarred Terra's surface and its psyche forever. I will tell you only of the moments that matter, the experiences that shaped what the Custodes would become, the wounds that we carry still. The walls fell. This is the truth that burns most deeply, the failure that defines us despite everything else we have done. The walls of the Imperial Palace, built to withstand anything, defended by the greatest warriors humanity had ever produced, sanctified by the presence of the Emperor himself. The walls fell. The traitors breached them, poured through the gaps, brought the war into the sacred spaces that we had been created to protect. I fought in those breaches. I killed until my arms burned with exhaustion, until my guardian's spear was so caked with blood that I could barely grip its haft, until the bodies of the fallen formed barricades that the enemy had to climb before they could reach us. I killed traitor space marines, those corrupted giants who had once been my comrades in the Great Crusade, who looked upon me with eyes that held nothing I recognized, whose souls had been hollowed out and filled with something that wore their faces but was not them, had never been them, would never be them again. I killed demons, entities that should not have existed, that mocked the laws of physics by their very presence, that giggled and shrieked and whispered promises as they died on my blade. I had never faced such things before. The Emperor had shielded us from the truth of the warp, had kept the knowledge of chaos from us as he had kept it from his sons, had believed that ignorance was protection when it was merely delay. Now I learned what lurked beyond the veil, and the learning cost me something that I cannot name, but feel the absence of still. Brothers fell around me. Custodians who had stood beside me since the Unification Wars, who had fought at my side for centuries, whose names I had spoken in the intimate silence of our order. They died, one by one, cut down by traitor blades, or consumed by warp fire, or simply overwhelmed by numbers that even our perfection could not overcome. I watched Amon Tauros fall to a demon prince whose name I will not speak. I watched Hyado Valoris dragged down by a tide of mutants whose hunger could not be sated. I watched brothers I had known for longer than most human civilizations endure become corpses, become memories, become absences that would never be filled. We were losing. This is the truth I must confess. The reality that the legends do not acknowledge. Despite our skill, despite our dedication, despite the absolute commitment of every custodian to the defense of the palace and the emperor within it, we were losing. The traitors were too many, their corruption too vast, their commitment to destruction too complete. For every enemy we killed, 10 more took their place. For every position we held, 3 others fell. The mathematics of the siege were inexorable, and they did not favor us. And then the Emperor made his choice. I was not present for the final confrontation. I was fighting in the anterior barbican when word came that the Emperor had teleported to Horus's flagship, had gone to face his son in single combat, had staked everything on a battle that only one of them would survive. I wanted to go to him. Every custodian on Terra wanted to go to him. But we could not, could only continue fighting, could only hold the lines while our father faced the son who had betrayed him, in the depths of a ship that had become a temple to dark gods. The Emperor won. Horus died. The traitors, their leader slain and their momentum broken, began to retreat from Terra. But victory and triumph are not the same thing. The Emperor returned to the palace broken. His body was ruined beyond any hope of healing. His spirit wounded in ways that even his immortal constitution could not repair. His light, that presence I had felt since the moment of my creation, that warmth that had sustained us through every battle and every loss, diminished to a flicker that threatened to go out entirely. He could not stand. He could not speak. He could barely exist, held together by will alone, while his sons and his servants scrambled to find some way to save him. The Golden Throne was the answer. A device he had been building for other purposes, repurposed now to sustain his failing form, to keep his spirit anchored to his body, to maintain the astronomicon that humanity required for interstellar travel. They placed him upon it in those desperate hours after the siege, connected his flesh to machines that would keep him alive, if alive was the right word for an existence of eternal agony. of endless suffering, of consciousness without relief or release. I was present when they sealed him to the throne. I watched his eyes as the final connections were made, as the devices that would sustain him became the devices that would imprison him, as the father I had served for millennia became something else, something that was neither alive nor dead, but trapped in a state between, a god of suffering whose pain would never end. He looked at me. For one moment, as the technicians completed their work and the throne began its eternal function, his eyes met mine, and I saw in them something I had never seen before, something that the Emperor had never permitted us to witness. Fear, grief, the terrible knowledge of what he was becoming, what he would remain, what the Imperium would become without his active guidance. And then the moment passed, and his eyes closed, and the Emperor of mankind began the vigil that would last for 10,000 years, and counting, a vigil of agony and sacrifice and silence that has defined everything we have done since that day. The heresy was over. The traitors had fled to the Eye of Terror. The Imperium had survived. But the Emperor we had served was gone. The Father we had followed was gone. The light that had guided us was dimmed to an ember that could warm nothing, illuminate nothing, promise nothing except continued existence at the cost of continued suffering. We stood before the golden throne, the survivors of the 10,000, and we understood that everything had changed. Our purpose, which had been clear since our creation, to protect the Emperor, to serve his will, to execute his commands, had become something else, something hollow, something that would define us for millennia to come. We would guard a corpse. We would serve a God who could not speak. We would maintain a vigil without end, without hope, without any certainty that what we did mattered to anyone except ourselves. The long vigil had begun, and we would keep it, no matter the cost, no matter the centuries, no matter the silence that would be our only answer. 10,000 years. I have spoken these words before. I will speak them again, because repetition is the only way to convey their weight. Because the human mind, even the enhanced mind of a custodian, struggles to encompass what such a span truly means. 10,000 years of standing vigil before the golden throne. 10,000 years of watching the Emperor's corpse form wither and decay, while the machines that sustain him groan with the effort of keeping him anchored to existence. 10,000 years of waiting for a command that never comes, a word that is never spoken, an acknowledgement that we have served faithfully and that our service has mattered. The silence is the worst of it. In the days before the heresy, the Emperor spoke to us. Not often. He was never given to unnecessary communication. But when guidance was needed, when decisions had to be made, when we required the touch of his will to know that we were acting in accordance with his design, he was there. His voice was not merely sound, but presence, a weight of meaning that settled into the mind and left no room for doubt, for questioning, for the uncertainty that plagues lesser beings when they must choose between competing paths. That voice is gone now. The Emperor has not spoken since they sealed him to the throne. Not to us, not to the high lords who govern in his name, not to anyone. He endures, he suffers, he maintains the Astronomicon through sheer force of will, sacrificing 1,000 psychers every day to keep the beacon burning, to keep humanity's ships sailing through the warp, to keep the Imperium he built from dissolving into isolated fragments that the darkness would consume one by one. But he does not speak, and in the absence of his voice, we have had to find our own way, have had to interpret his will through texts and traditions and the fading memory of what he commanded when commands were still possible, have had to become something we were never designed to be, autonomous, self-directing, capable of choosing our own path when the path he set us upon ended at the foot of a golden throne that gives nothing back. I have stood before that throne more times than I can count. I have looked upon the Emperor's face, if the ruin that remains can be called a face. And I have searched for some sign, some flicker, some indication that he knows I am there, that he remembers who I am, that my millennia of service have registered in whatever consciousness still exists behind those sunken eyes. I have never found it. The Emperor's gaze is fixed on distances I cannot perceive, on battles being fought in dimensions I cannot access, on a war that continues in the warp itself while his body sits motionless, and his servants wait for guidance that will never come. Some of my brothers have broken under this weight. We do not speak of them often. The Custodes are not meant to break. We are designed for perfection, engineered to endure stresses that would shatter lesser beings, trained across decades to maintain absolute control over our minds and our emotions. But 10,000 years is a long time, even for us. 10,000 years of silence, of waiting, of purposeless purpose. It has worn at the edges of even custodian resolve. I have watched brothers walk into the webway and never return, seeking death in battle against the demons that press eternally against the seals the Emperor placed there. I have watched brothers remove their armor and take up the robes of the eyes of the Emperor, abandoning the palace to walk among humanity as spies and observers, unable to bear the weight of the vigil any longer. I have watched brothers simply stop, standing at their posts until their bodies failed, until the spirit that animated them finally flickered out, until they became statues of gold and flesh that had to be removed so that others could take their places. And I have wondered, in the darkest hours of the endless night watches, whether I would be next, whether the weight would finally become too great for even my shoulders to bear, whether the silence would finally drown me as it has drowned so many others. It has not yet, perhaps not ever. But the wondering itself is a kind of breaking, a crack in the perfection that we were created to embody. And I have learned across these millennia that I am not alone in my wondering, that behind the golden masks we present to the world, my brothers carry the same doubts, the same weariness, the same desperate need for meaning that the vigil cannot provide. We have found ways to endure, rituals and traditions, practices that give structure to the formless eternity of our service, the painting of our armor with the names of fallen brothers, so that we carry them with us, so that their sacrifice is not forgotten even if there is no one else to remember. The blood games in which we test the palace's defenses by attempting to breach them, keeping our skills sharp through simulated assassination attempts on the very master we protect. The endless training, the constant refinement of abilities that were already refined to perfection before the heresy began, because training gives purpose when purpose has been stripped away. And the black library of whispered heresies, where some among us have dared to question whether the path we walk is the only path, whether the interpretations we have made of the Emperor's will are the correct interpretations, whether the Imperium that has grown from his sacrifice is what he would have wanted, or a grotesque parody of his original vision. I have read those texts, I have heard those questions, and I have found no answers, only more questions, only the growing certainty that we are adrift in a sea of uncertainty, clinging to a duty that may have lost its meaning millennia ago, serving a master who may no longer be capable of caring whether we serve or not. This is the crucible of the long vigil, not the battles we have fought, though we have fought battles, have defended the palace against incursions that the histories do not record, have killed threats that came within steps of the Golden Throne itself. The crucible is the silence, the waiting, the knowledge that we are alone, that our Father cannot guide us, that we must find our own reasons to continue when every reason we were given died with his voice. And then, in the year 999 of the 41st millennium, everything changed. Abaddon the Despoiler launched his 13th Black Crusade, the greatest assault upon the Imperium since the heresy itself. Cardia fell, that fortress world that had guarded the Eye of Terror for 10,000 years, that had been the Imperium's shield against the darkness. Cadia fell, and the great rift tore across the galaxy, splitting humanity's domain in two, drowning thousands of worlds in warp storms that made travel and communication impossible. And Robout Guilliman, the Primarch of the Ultramarines, returned. I was present when he came to the palace. I stood among the 10,000 as the son of the Emperor, the only loyal son to survive the heresy, preserved in stasis for 10 millennia, resurrected through technologies and rituals that should not have been possible, walked the halls we had guarded since our creation. I watched him approach the Golden Throne, watched him kneel before the Father he had not seen since the days of the Great Crusade, watched the communion that passed between them in a language that none of us could hear. And I watched him emerge from that chamber changed, hardened, burdened with knowledge that he would not share, with commands that he would not reveal, with a weight upon his shoulders that seemed almost as great as the weight we had carried for 10,000 years. He looked at us, at the Custodes, at the Guardians who had waited in silence while the galaxy burned around us, and I saw something in his eyes that I did not expect. Not contempt, though we had feared contempt, had feared that a Primarch who had spent his existence fighting would see our vigil as cowardice, our isolation as abandonment of the Imperium we were meant to serve, not dismissal, as though our role no longer mattered in a galaxy that had changed beyond recognition. What I saw was grief, grief for what we had endured, for what we had lost, for the 10,000 years we had spent guarding a silence that could offer no comfort, grief for brothers he had never known, warriors who had been ancient when he was born, who had served his father since before humanity reached the stars, and beneath the grief, something else, a recognition that we were needed, that our vigil was not ending but transforming, that the skills and dedication we had maintained through millennia of isolation were about to be called upon in ways we had never anticipated. The Emperor has spoken, Guilliman told us. He has given me his commands, and among them is this: the Custodes will no longer guard only the palace. The galaxy burns, and those who were created to defend it must take their place in its defense. 10,000 years of waiting, 10,000 years of silence, of doubt, of searching for meaning in a duty that seemed to have lost its purpose, and in a single moment everything changed. We were needed again, not as guards, but as warriors, not as keepers of a tomb, but as soldiers in a war that spanned the entire galaxy. The Primarch had given us purpose, or rather, had revealed that our purpose had never truly ended, had merely been waiting for the moment when it would be required once more. I remember the feeling that swept through the ranks of the 10,000 in that moment. Not joy, custodians are not given to joy, but something like relief, like the lifting of a weight that had been pressing down upon us for so long that we had forgotten what it felt like to stand without it. The silence was broken. The waiting was over. We had been called, and we would answer. The Indomitus Crusade began. Guilliman led the forces of the Imperium in a campaign to reclaim what had been lost, to reunite the sundered halves of humanity's domain, to push back the darkness that had poured through the great rift. And we went with him, custodians beyond the walls of the palace for the first time in 10 millennia, fighting alongside space marines and Imperial Guard, bringing the Emperor's wrath to enemies who had thought themselves beyond its reach. I have killed more in the years since Gilliman's return than I killed in all the centuries before. I have walked the surfaces of worlds I never expected to see, have faced enemies I never expected to face, have remembered what it felt like to be a weapon rather than a monument. And I have carried with me into every battle the weight of all those millennia, the brothers who fell, the silence that shaped us, the waiting that defined us. We are changed. The long vigil has marked us in ways that cannot be undone, has made us something different from the warriors who fought in the Great Crusade, who knew the Emperor as a living presence rather than a silent absence. But we endure, we serve, we continue to fulfill the purpose for which we were created, adapted now to a galaxy that has transformed beyond recognition, committed still to the defense of humanity and the Emperor who sits in silent agony at its heart. This is what we have become. This is what 10,000 years have made us. And this is what we will remain until the end of all things. I stand now in the Hall of 1,000 Thrones, in that vast chamber where the statues of fallen custodians line the walls in endless rows, their golden forms frozen in the postures of their final moments, their names inscribed in adamantine plaques that will endure until the palace itself crumbles to dust. I come here often, in the hours between duties, in the quiet spaces that the vigil still affords despite its transformation. I come to remember. I come to bear witness to those who fell so that I might continue. There are brothers here who died in the Unification Wars, whose statues have stood for 11,000 years, whose faces I remember though no one else remains who knew them. There are brothers who fell during the Siege of Terror, whose sacrifice bought the hours that humanity needed to survive, whose names I speak in the silence of my own mind, because speaking them aloud would be to admit that even custodians can feel loss, can grieve, can carry wounds that do not heal, no matter how many millennia pass. There are brothers who died in the long vigil, defending the palace against threats that the histories do not record, or simply fading away when the weight of the silence became too great to bear. And there are new statues now, brothers who have fallen since Gilliman's return, since we emerged from our isolation to fight in a galaxy that had changed beyond recognition. The wars of the Adeptus crusade have cost us, have added names to the roles of the fallen, have reminded us that we are not immortal, that even the Emperor's finest can be brought low by sufficient force or sufficient darkness. I will join them one day. This is the certainty that every custodian carries, the knowledge that our service ends only in death, that no retirement awaits us, no peaceful fading into honored obsolescence. We serve until we fall, and then we become statues in halls like this one, monuments to sacrifice that the galaxy will never acknowledge, that only our brothers will remember. This should be a burden. Perhaps it is, in some way that I have become too accustomed to notice. But when I stand in this hall, when I look upon the faces of those who came before me, and those who will come after, I do not feel burdened. I feel connected. I feel part of something larger than myself, larger than any individual existence, larger even than the 10,000 years I have witnessed. We are continuity. This is what I have come to understand across millennia of contemplation, across endless hours of silent vigil before a throne that gives nothing back. The Imperium changes around us. It has changed beyond recognition since the days of unity, has become something that the emperor might not acknowledge as his creation, has ossified into a theocracy that worships a god who never wished to be worshipped. But we remain, we persist, we carry within us the memory of what was, the knowledge of what the emperor intended, the connection to an origin that the rest of humanity has mythologized beyond recognition. When I look upon the Imperium of the 42nd millennium, I see an empire of lies and cruelty, of oppression and ignorance, of suffering institutionalized and hope forbidden. The bureaucracy that governs in the emperor's name has become a beast that devours the very people it claims to protect. The ecclesiarchy preaches a faith that the emperor explicitly rejected, that he spent millennia trying to prevent, that mocks everything he sacrificed to build. The institutions of humanity have become parodies of their original purposes, shells that retain the forms of what they were meant to be, while betraying every principle that gave those forms meaning. And yet the Imperium endures, and yet humanity survives, and yet the darkness that presses against the borders of civilization has not yet won, has not consumed the species that the Emperor gave everything to preserve. Perhaps this is enough. Perhaps endurance is its own justification, survival its own meaning. The galaxy is not kind. It does not reward virtue or punish cruelty. It simply is, vast and indifferent and hostile to everything that lives within it. To persist in such a galaxy, to maintain coherence across 10,000 years and 1,000,000 worlds, to continue existing when every force in the universe seems designed to ensure extinction. Perhaps this is the only victory that matters, the only triumph that can be measured, the only meaning that the cosmos permits. The Emperor understood this. I believe that now, after 10 millennia of contemplation. He did not build the Imperium because he believed humanity deserved salvation, or because he loved us in the way that the ecclesiarchy claims, or because some cosmic destiny demanded that our species achieve greatness. He built it because the alternative was extinction, because the galaxy would devour us if we did not band together, because survival required unity, and unity required the structures he created, however imperfect, however prone to corruption, however far they might drift from his original intentions. We Custodes are part of that understanding. We were not created to be heroes, to inspire legends, to embody ideals that ordinary humans might aspire to. We were created to be effective, to serve a specific purpose in the Emperor's design, to fill a role that required beings of our particular capabilities. The fact that we have endured beyond that role's original parameters, that we have adapted to serve purposes the Emperor may never have anticipated, that we have found meaning in a vigil that was never meant to last this long. This is not triumph. It is merely continuation. But continuation matters. In a galaxy where everything tends toward entropy, where civilizations rise and fall and are forgotten, where even gods can die and empires can crumble to dust, continuation is the only resistance possible, the only defiance that the universe cannot ultimately overcome. We continue, therefore we win, if winning is measured not in territory conquered or enemies slain, but in simple, stubborn persistence against odds that should have destroyed us long ago. I think of the Emperor sometimes, in the quiet hours when I stand before his throne and search his ruined face for some sign of the being I once knew. I wonder if he is aware, somewhere in the depths of his eternal agony, of what his creation has become. I wonder if he knows that we still serve, still guard, still carry the memory of what he was when he was something more than a corpse sustained by sacrifice. I wonder if our vigil brings him any comfort, any solace, any relief from the suffering that has been his existence for 10,000 years. I do not know. I cannot know. The Emperor does not speak does not acknowledge, does not give any sign that he perceives the world around him or the servants who have dedicated their existence to his protection. But I serve anyway. I stand vigil anyway. I continue anyway, because continuation is what I was made for, because service is the only purpose I have ever known, because even meaningless duty is preferable to no duty at all. And perhaps, in the depths of my being, where hope still flickers despite 10 millennia of silence, perhaps he does know. Perhaps some fragment of his awareness perceives us still, recognizes the golden guardians who have never abandoned him, draws some measure of strength from the knowledge that his custodes remain faithful, remain steadfast, remain exactly what he created us to be. I will never know for certain. None of us will. The silence that has defined our existence since the heresy will continue until the Emperor dies or speaks, or the galaxy itself comes to an end. But I will stand anyway. I will serve anyway. I will carry the weight of 10,000 years, and however many more are granted to me, because this is what I am, what I was made to be, what I will remain until the breath leaves my body, and my form is cast in gold to join the brothers who fell before me. I am Diocletian Koros. I am one of the 10,000. I have stood vigil for 10,000 years, and I will stand for 10,000 more, if that is what duty requires. The Emperor may not hear me. The galaxy may not remember me. The histories may never record my name or the names of my brothers, may never acknowledge the sacrifice we have made and continue to make, may never understand what it means to serve in silence, without recognition, without reward, without any certainty that service matters. But I will serve anyway. This is what it means to be a custodian. This is the truth that 10,000 years have taught me. We are the Emperor's final gift to humanity. We are the guardians who never falter, the watchers who never sleep, the golden blades that stand between our species and extinction. We are continuity and memory and the refusal to surrender, even when surrender seems the only rational choice. We are the Adeptus Custodes, and we will endure until the stars themselves grow cold, until the last human draws their final breath, until the Emperor himself releases us from the duty he inscribed upon our souls before the Imperium was born. This is our oath. This is our burden. This is our meaning, and it is enough. It has to be enough, because it is all we have.